Welcome! Today we're going to make some simple boats, and I'm going to make them in map style using 1-inch squares, which are 25.4 millimeters. I'm going to go ahead and set up my grid first with about a 0.5 millimeter space in between them, and then we'll start with a rowboat that's about a 5 foot by 10 foot boat and go from there. My grid will be 1 millimeter tall, and I'll be referencing the maps from D&D Beyond and other references that I can find. This rowboat picture is obviously wrong because that's way bigger than 5 by 10, which the one that I make is also a little bit too big, but I'm going to fix that in the end. Now that I have my grid size, I'm going to use cylinders and squares to make the boat shape, and then I'm going to copy the shape and make it a little bit smaller and raise it up by 1 millimeter to hollow out the boat. I thought it would be a good idea to use the bevel so that it gives it that little bit of a boat look, but in the end it was just easier to use the normal shapes. But for now, this is what we're going to try to see what it looks like. I want the bottom to be perfectly flat to be easier to print, and also to be able to print these without supports. I have my boat shape. I'm going to make a copy of it, make it slightly smaller and raise it up a millimeter to make the boat hollow. I also made it a little too big, like I mentioned before, so I have to make my grid bigger so that it will fit. And then I actually ended up doing it the hard way of cutting out my boat shape for the grid, and I will show you the easy way later. But in this instance, I make a copy of my boat, turn it into a hole, and use that to cut out my shape, and then use more holes to cut out the excess squares, which takes a lot of time and is not the best way to do that. I will show you a much simpler way on the next boat, and then we'll come back and fix this boat. I also like to make copies of everything so that if I do mess something up, I have something to go back to, or if I need to make duplicates, I already have the grid. Or in this case where I start with a smaller boat and then make a bigger boat, I already have the smaller grid, so that all I can do is copy and paste and make a bigger grid as I group them together. Again, this method is very tedious for cutting out the excess squares without making it cut into the actual design that we want to keep. So this is a lesson of what not to do. Once we have our grid shape, we just raise it up a millimeter and then align it to center with our other shape and then group it together. And then we will go ahead and use some squares to make some benches. The front one sticks out a little bit, so before I group it with the rest of the boat, I will use some squares holes, angle them, and cut off those edges that are sticking out before I combine it with the total boat. And then next we will move on to a bigger boat, the keel boat, which is 60 foot by 20 foot, which is going to be 12 by 4 squares. So we're going to make our grid bigger to the size that we want, and then we will continue to make our boat shape like we did before by using a square and a cylinder and shape it the way that we want before cutting it out of our grid. I was trying to figure out how to get that taper into the bottom of the boat in the easiest way, so I was playing around with a bunch of shapes, but really the easiest after playing around with it would be to just use the cylinder and then get your square or your rectangle and use your rectangle to be exactly in the midpoint of your cylinder. And then after that, I actually decided it would be easy to just use some squares, even though I played with other shapes to try and taper it. And that's the best thing to do, is just play with shapes until you get it how you want it. But in this case, it would have been easier to just use some longer rectangles and then put them on each side at a slight angle and just shave off the sides, which is what I ended up doing. And once I had my shape, we do the easy way of cutting it out, which is to take that original shape make a copy of it, turn it into a hole, get a square and encapsulate that with that, and then cut it out of that square, and then use the square with the cookie cutter of the size that you need and just chop that in one combination to get that shape. So much easier. Then we again make a copy of our shape, turn it into a hole, move it up 1 millimeter, and make it slightly smaller so that we have walls to hollow out our boat. This one is going to be too big to print, so I need to chop it in half in the end. So I want to make my walls big enough that in this case I would like to use 5mm by 1mm magnets to hold it together. So I make a little hole that's 5.25 by 1.25 millimeters and make sure that my walls are going to be thick enough to be able to put those magnets in there as well. We then make sure that our grid is raised up 1 millimeter so that it fits right on top of the bottom layer of our boat, and then combine that together. This boat also has a cabin and a mast and a bunch of row seats, so I'm going to make my cabin wall that I will later cut a door hole out of, and then make my mast out of a cylinder and use a bunch of rectangles for the row seats. Once I have all the row seats aligned, I'm going to make a copy of them so that I can just paste it to the other side and then lengthen them into the walls of the ship. For the door, it's just a square and a cylinder on their sides to make a door shape. I will get the shape the size that I want so that I can make it into a hole as well and cut it out of the wall, and then use a cylinder to make a simple doorknob, and then place the door in the middle of the hole, and it will be slightly thinner than the wall so that it will be a more prominent shape in there, but will also be small enough that you won't need to use supports to print it. I then decide to put some holes in for the oars, so I just take a cylinder, make it really small, make it really tall, flip it over, and then make sure that it will go through the boat. I will do this at each of the row benches. Of course, our mast will get in the way, so I'll have to take one of them and separate it and just go along the outsides of that post. Or I could just ungroup it until the mast part wasn't in there and then just group it with the walls and then regroup everything else, but in this case I just made two poles and put them on the outsides of the mast. I then make a copy that I can use in the event that you wanted to make it multiple decks. You could just use that same shape and then just change the floor plan. So if I wanted to make the cabin covered on top for like a quarter deck, you could do that, or you could just cut out the middle section and make two pieces and have a little quarter deck and a front deck. Whatever you want to do. In this case though, it's just one straight deck, so that's all I'm going to do. But if you wanted to do multiple layers, that's how you would do it. So now I make a copy of my main deck because I need it to be into two pieces. So then I will cut it in half on the front on one side and the back on the other side so that I have my two halves. In this case, it does cut through the middle of one of the oar holes, which I don't really want, even though it doesn't really matter. I go ahead and just move the holes slightly so that it doesn't cut through the middle of them. Now that I have my two halves, I'm going to take my magnet holes, and in this case I can fit about 3 of them on each side, and to make sure that they line up properly, I'm going to make a group of 3 that are lined up the same, make copies of those for each of the sections that I'm going to put holes in, and then make sure that I go right up against the model so that you can see both the solid and the hole, and that's how you know that it's flush. And then go ahead and group those to cut out the holes for those. The magnets do an okay job of holding it together as long as you're not moving it around or picking it up by 1/2. They're not strong enough to hold the whole thing together. So later what I end up doing is using a wedge, both the shape to add on to 1/2 and then as a hole on the other half that's slightly larger, and then that way I can just slide the 2 pieces together, and you can either leave it modular by sliding them together, or you can just put some glue on there and have it all one piece glued together. And now I will implement the things that I've learned to fix the rowboat. Now it's time for you to show that this video was helpful by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you for watching and for your support. Show some love by becoming a patron on my Patreon and get access to these boat files along with a longship, sailing or warship, galley, and a fun custom small sailboat. Not to mention discounts at 3DM Tabletop on accessories like these, dice, minis, and more. Now go make some boats and sail off into the sunset.